been practicing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu for quite some time. And I've competed in the major tournaments in North America and Brazil. I've had my share of wins and losses, and like anyone, I'm proud of the medals I've won, and I still feel a bit of regret over the matches that I lost, because I know I could have done better. Even though I've learned something at each tournament. There was one small event I competed in years ago that shed some unique light on how tournament wins and losses fit into the big picture. Because right after that tournament, I had a brush with death. And that made the result of the tournament itself seem kind of trivial. So the tournament was called the Third Copa Grande Mestre João Alberto Primeira Etapa do Ranking Rio Open Circuito Mineiro do Jiu-Jitsu 2012. Which is probably the longest name I've ever seen for anything. But at least some of that was necessary, because the tournament was a tribute to a locally well-respected jiu-jitsu professor, and it was part of some bigger eliminator series, and it was sponsored by a soft drink that looked like cola, smelled like moist soil, and tasted like carbonated coffee. I remember there was another tournament happening that same day in another part of Rio de Janeiro, and that one was being sponsored by Rockstar Energy Drink. So it sounded cooler to me, since I'd at least seen that drink in stores before. But my team was going to this one, so I ended up going to the one sponsored by the strange, dirt-flavored Brazilian coffee cola. I got there early because I had no idea when I was fighting. Once I got there, I found there was no timetable anywhere to give me any idea about when I was fighting. So I just sat in the stands and listened for hours and hours to the voice in Portuguese that was calling names, most of which sounded the same, since about 3/4 of Brazilian men are named either Pedro, Paulo, Thiago, or Rodrigo. Anyway, hours passed as I watched children wearing yellow and orange belts grapple with each other using moves I'd only learned myself quite recently as a new black belt. Suffice to say, it was obvious that jiu-jitsu in Brazil was on a totally different level than in Canada. Just like Brazilian ice hockey is woefully underdeveloped when compared to, Canadian ice hockey or the NHL. Luckily, this wasn't my first trip to Brazil. So I'd already had the chance to test myself against Brazilian opponents a few years earlier in 2009. This was when I won the Brazilian National Championships. I won bronze there, as well as gold at the World Cup, the Copa do Mundo in Niterói, which is beside Rio de Janeiro. And these wins gave me some confidence that I brought to Brazil for my second trip. So, anyway. So after sitting in the stands for 5 or 6 hours, I heard someone badly mispronounce my name over the speaker system, calling me to the bullpen. Jefe Mercados, So I was relieved that I hadn't missed them calling me, because I'd been sitting there for hours wondering if they'd called me and I'd missed it, and now here was my chance. So I was relieved, but relief is a strange emotion to bring into a match. Also, at the club I'd been training at, I had been fighting monsters for weeks and weeks. So I'd been playing mostly a defensive game, and a defensive game is good for avoiding injuries, but it's not so good for winning in tournaments. I remember my first match. My opponent was a little bit shorter than me and a little bit heavier, and I probably should have just torn him limb from limb. I should have been more aggressive. But I was so used to the beatings I was taking every day at the club, I had the wrong frame of mind, and I was barely able to squeak out a win. In fact, at first, the referee raised my opponent's arm, but then my instructor at the time argued with the referee until he decided to raise my arm instead. I think I won on points for a throw. Anyway, in my second match, it was against a guy, a 4th degree black belt, who had beaten his first opponent in the opening round by 20-0 or 30-0, right? So my instructor said, listen, this guy's real good. Just use your judo. Because I'd been throwing people in the club a little bit, and it seemed like the one skill, that I was able to use in training. So what happened? This guy, my opponent, he shoots a double leg on me. I sprawl, and I decide to just hang out there. And we're kind of half in the scoring area. My legs are kind of in the safety area. We're not off the mat. We're just kind of in the, And I'm just hanging out there. And I could have gone for Tsumagayashi. I could have gone for some kind of, rolling omoplata or a submission or whatever. But for whatever reason, I was just hanging out there thinking, I'm going to tire this guy out a bit. Maybe they're going to move us. And then the referee did. He stopped us, and he moved us back to the middle of the match. And I thought, okay, they're going to start the fight again. But that wasn't what was going on. Unbeknownst to me, the time for the match had expired. The match was over. And since my opponent had shot in, and I'd done nothing except sprawl, they gave the win to my opponent. They raised his arm. And I wasn't happy about that. But at this event, there were no time clocks or whatever. So I had no idea how much time was left in the match. Imagine playing hockey or soccer or football with no idea how much time is left in the game. It's quite disorienting, and it seriously affects what you decide to do. In my case, I had done nothing whatsoever, aside from just sprawling. So anyway, match 1, I had won, but not, in a way that I was satisfied with. Match 2, I had lost. That one was also kind of annoying, because if I had gone for something, maybe I could have, won that one too. So now I had a chance to compete in the absolute, in the open weight. And the guy I was fighting was the fellow who had lost to my second opponent by 30-0 or whatever. So anyway, I thought this time I am actually going to do something. I won the first match with a throw, I think, and the second one I lost, defending a takedown. For this one, I thought, I'm going to pull guard, just to mix it up. In retrospect, that was a terrible idea. I mean, my opponent was short, and he was wide, he was bald, and probably full of steroids. So when I pulled guard, it was like I had sat down and wrapped my legs around a fire hydrant. I actually pulled half guard, as I'd gotten pretty good at using an underhook, but since he was shorter than me, he immediately got the underhooks on me, and my half guard game was shut down. Then he passed a side control, and I pushed off to bridge, and he caught me in a wrist lock. So let's review what happened that day. First, I fought in a weird way. I fought with some hesitancy, if that's a word. Because I'd been taking beatings in the club I was training at, and I was so used to just playing defensively. I played too defensively against my first opponent, right? And I still won, but wasn't very satisfying. Then in my second match, I didn't really do anything at all. The guy shot and I sprawled. Time ran out. There was no clocks for anybody to see. Then, So I'd done nothing, he'd done something. They gave the win to him. And then in the third match, I did something, but it was the wrong thing. You shouldn't pull guard against, short, muscular dudes. At least not half guard, or at least the way I did it, So anyway, after the fights, I posed with my medals on the tournament podium. I pretended I was satisfied with my performance that day, but I wasn't. Even after consoling myself in the stands with chocolate and beer, I wasn't feeling good about it. But that was all about to change. So, after everyone else had fought, my teammates, what have you, it was time to go home. And it began to rain. Not normal rain. This was rainforest rain. A kind of rain you've probably never seen before. Each raindrop was the size of a plum. And the water was falling so hard, and there was so much of it, I could see waves. Like waves you would see in the ocean, except this was waves in the sky. Waves in the sky. That's how hard it was raining. But not at first. At first, I could see it raining in the distance. And there was a wall of water moving along the street, where on one side it wasn't raining, and on the other side it was raining so hard, the world was basically underwater at that point. Someone yelled, "Run!" So we all ran like people in a disaster movie and jumped into our vehicles. I was getting a ride home with my instructor at the time. Before I continue this story, I'd like to share a bit of a backstory on this person, which I didn't know at the time, by the way. So, without naming names, because that's not important to the story, I'll tell you a bit about him. He got his black belt before I even started training, and he won all kinds of titles and trophies, and then he stopped doing jiu-jitsu for quite some time. At the time when I was getting in the vehicle, I didn't know why, but later I heard he'd been in a terrible car accident, and doctors had told him that he'd be lucky to walk again, never mind do jiu-jitsu again. So, the one thing you should retain from what I've just said is that this guy, into whose car I was getting, or into whose vehicle I was getting, this guy had been in a terrible accident, a terrible car accident, and that's why he couldn't train for years. Would you get into this person's car? I did. Now, back to the story. After we leapt in his vehicle to get away from the insane rainstorm that was pounding down from overhead, he began speeding along like we were being chased by a monster. Now, I don't know about you, but when I'm driving a vehicle in a rainstorm, I tend to slow down. But not this guy. He sped up like we were in a chase scene from a movie, and he began tearing down a narrow road with no visibility. And this was with the windshield wipers going at full speed. Through the windshield, we could see nothing. Nothing. It was like we were underwater and plunging ahead at like a ridiculous momentum. He was going so fast, the vehicle was hydroplaning through puddles. I was in the passenger seat, and when I looked out the window to my right, I saw huge trees whipping past just half a foot away. Oh, and before I forget to share this, we were listening to the Jack Johnson song, Banana Pancakes. To this day, hearing that song will give me panic attacks. Sure, that's funny now, but at the time, it was terrifying. It's actually incredible I didn't wet my pants. And there would have been no way to see it anyway, since we were all soaked by the rain that had swept down over us, like a tsunami before we leapt in the vehicle. Anyway, at the time, with the relaxing song playing, I was certain we were about to collide with something that was right in front of us that we couldn't see. And then the car would be knocked to pieces and we would drown in, a foot of water with every bone in our bodies broken 10 times over, and perhaps with our heads on fire, thanks to a spray of burning fuel. But that's not what happened. Nope. I just got dropped off at a beach near where I was living in Rio de Janeiro. Now, let me ask you, are you still thinking about the tournament? Or the fights I had? How important to this story do they seem? For me, I was beside myself with happiness and relief. The fact that I'd been in a tournament earlier that day, and that I had been unsatisfied with my performance at the tournament, it was the last thing on my mind. Because I had just had a near-death experience, and now I was totally fine. And no one knew about it except for me and the crazy guy who'd been grooving out to Jack Johnson while plunging through wave after wave of water, beyond which could have been a tree or a ditch or a car or anything you don't want to collide with going, 100 kilometers an hour. All I could do was laugh and laugh and laugh until tears of joy ran down my cheeks. Sitting there on the beach, I danced and shouted and cheered and fell in love with life all over again. And I realized that the tournament and the little medals I'd won, they didn't matter at all, next to the reality that I'd nearly lost my life, but had now been given a whole new appreciation for it, and everything that comes with it. And that's better than any medal I've ever won.